Well, hello and welcome. You find yourself checking out the Primary Arms Classic 1 to 4x24 LPVO. This is a second focal plane scope featuring the illuminated duplex dot, meaning that as we go to 4x, the scope's maximum magnification, the reticle does not change size. There's a little bit of darkening around the edges, but it's not terrible, and when you're behind it and using it, you don't really notice it all too much. Illumination on this thing isn't terrible. It's not what I would consider to be daytime bright, but it's honestly pretty decent, and you're going to see that a little more as we go on. We go from maximum to minimum illumination and then back up. Overall, it's not terrible, and if you're using this in darker environments, it'll be more than adequate. One thing you have to remember though is that this is a $130 LPVO and officially the cheapest one I've ever reviewed. Nearly $30 cheaper than the Athlon Talos BTR 1 to 4 that I had reviewed. But you know what? Let's see how this thing tracks. Let's crank on the illumination, which as you can see is not very impressive by anyone's standards. And it's going to be a little bit difficult for me to return these turrets perfectly to zero because there's no real clear indication, because it's got that little steel ring inside and I got it kind of lined up with the dimples, but we're going to give it a shot nonetheless. Start with the windage. I'm just going to keep cranking until it basically gets stuck like that. I am not bottoming these out to the point where they're jamming up. That is a lot of windage adjustment. Let's see if I can get this thing back to zero. Yep, that's zero on the turret, and that looks to be pretty much zero on the reticle. A twist. Let's see where it lines up. All right, we are completely out of twisting. You could hear it. The turret still spins, but the reticle is not turning. Uh-oh. Okay. All right, we're good. We're good. All right, so the turret itself is shown 0.2 of a click low. Let's go up and see if, when we return back down, if it'll line up properly. So on the glass it is, and on the turret it is. So the turret's reading zero where we started out at, and the reticle is obviously quite fairly lined up. Not bad for a $120 scope. It really is not bad. As you can see here, looking at a 30-yard power transformer 1X with the illumination off, it's got a surprisingly decent looking image. It's fairly bright and clear with decent color representation. The only real negative is how much of the scope body you could see. Zooming into 4X, you could see a little chromatic aberration creeping up, but it's not, again, terrible. My camera's exposure likes to freak out sometimes, so that's all that was, nothing to do with the scope. Illumination here is now set at full, and you can clearly see it when I cover up the front that it is on, and you can see some slight red discoloration to the dot. Now again, for the price of $130, I'm not expecting this thing to be as bright as, let's say, a Razer HD Gen 2, for example. As we pan across these cables, you can see at 4X there isn't too much distortion to the glass. The only thing I can see is towards the edge it does get a little fuzzy. That and again that little bit of chromatic aberration. Panning off that 30-yard pole, and we start to stretch it out a little bit further. That tree line is roughly 200 to 300 yards, and you can see that this glass struggles to bring out the finer details in that muddled mess. Panning across the rooftop to our 400-yard steel door, and yeah, the exposure value is slightly over, and that is my fault, I apologize, but you can still make out some decent details. Granted, you can't count all the bricks on the side of the wall, but you can't really expect that much from a 4X scope anyway. Those power towers off in the distance roughly 800 yards away, and this does good enough that you can count almost all the components of each structure. If I was to make one quick comparison, it would be against the Vortex Crossfire 2 1 to 4 that I reviewed many moons ago. These scopes are almost identical, but that's $200 and had yellow tint to the glass. Let's move it into a slightly darker environment, shall we? So we start with the illumination at 1 and bring it all the way up to its maximum level of 11. Here's where it's going to stay for the remainder of the video. Two things to note before we go inside. One, just how much of the scope body you can see, just like I pointed out earlier, and two, that we're slightly lower than perfect center. The scope seems to have a fairly forgiving eye box at 1X and still continues to have one at 4X, which we're going to touch on more later. But just know that you can be quite off of perfect center behind this scope and still be able to look through it with little issue. Pew pew, pew pew pew. So I may or may not have been slightly intoxicated when I went to go film this segment. I was feeling really good and decided to
hum the James Bond theme. I don't know why it came out, but it just did, and I just said fuck it and decided to roll with it.
Do 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 pew 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 pew. Pew pew.
The takeaway from all this is actually that the 1X on this scope is surprisingly good. Very easy to use with both eyes open as well. And the same goes for 4X.
Grogu has been saved.
Grogu is not harmed in the filming of this video. My wife would have killed me. So from pretty bright to pretty dark, we find ourselves at this very cloudy, overcast day. It had snowed earlier in the day, and if you have ever been in an environment where it snows, you know exactly that gray sort of muck that the sky can be. I take my time going around all these obstacles and really try to give a feel for, again, just how good the 1X is on this thing. Now, I don't just film this and say, it's good. I walk around the exact same area that I film, either before or afterwards, take the camera off, and I walk around to actually use it the way I would be using it. Granted, it's not mounted on top of a rifle or anything, because that would just be retarded if I was walking around with a gun like some people think that I do, but I still get a good sense of how well it can operate. Maxing out the magnification here to 4X, and the dot is still very clearly visible in the darker areas. Once we transverse that into the snowy areas, it sort of fades away, but again, only so much can be expected for a $130 scope. I'm not going to say, this is the worst scope ever because the illumination isn't that great, when in actuality, even more expensive optics don't necessarily perform that much better than this. Now, by saying that, I've opened up a gigantic can of worms, but just know that there's a ratio of performance versus cost, and I feel that this thing is performing at least as well as what it costs. Now, as far as longevity, I can't really say too much about. However, overall feel, optics, and controls, it's holding up very well. Moving to our 50-yard range, we sweep from the right to the left. Take note of the backstop slightly shifting inside the scope as opposed to how it is in actual real life. However, that is something that's very common on most LPVOs that I've tested. There's only been one or two that really haven't had that much of a shift. Don't know why. Illumination is now at maximum, and you can just pick it up on the bullseye of that target at 50 yards. Again, once we go into the really high contrast white areas, it completely gets washed out. Now, these targets do have primarily 22 LR holes in it, and if you can pick any of them up at 50 yards with this, it's pretty impressive. To some of you, you might have noticed that I moved the scope slightly closer to the camera, and the reason for that is, I might have actually messed up. But it's nice to know that you can be slightly off of the perfect eye box and still be able to look through it. You know what? Speaking of eye box, let's take a look at that now. Starting with 1X, and you can see just how wide open this thing is. You can get crazy amounts of eye relief on it. And you know what? You can get the scope body down to being almost nothing, but you won't be able to look through it at 4X. Before we get there, let's take a look at 2X right now. Bring it up to 2X, and you can see that the eye box does start to get a little bit smaller. However, it's still quite usable. 2 to 3X is a really good magnification range that I find myself using quite often, and the 2X on this is very forgiving and very little distortion as well. Now here at the scope's maximum magnification of 4X, and yes, when we pull back from it, it does get tight, but you can still look through it relatively easily. That's why I said the 4X on this is pretty good, because even if you're off by a fair amount, you can still use it, and that is pretty impressive. Moving it into the garage for our final segment before my final thoughts, and when we crank the illumination up in a dark environment like this, it is perfect. Perfect to use in an environment like this. Not perfect overall, but, it's better than nothing. Again, the 1X shines through as being very true to 1X, not having a lot of distortion, being bright, and being clear. It's really funny to me because on the Athlon Talos BTR 1-4 that I reviewed a couple months ago, I had a similar experience with the 1X on that scope. The 1X on that was excellent for what it was.
Pew pew.
And this is not much different. This thing, for the price, really impresses me. And you got to remember that it's about the price versus performance, like I touched on earlier. Yeah, you can find better scopes, but for the $130 that this comes in, which is the cheapest I've ever reviewed, that still manages to have illumination that is sort of usable, is impressive. And before we get into my final thoughts, I'm going to let you enjoy the rest of this scene.
Pew pew. Pew pew. Pew pew.
So I want to wrap this in a nice, neat bow. For $130, this is excellent. It's not perfect. There are some flaws, but for the price, you almost can't afford to ignore it. If, let's say, you want to get your hands onto your first LPVO, or if you're using this for airsoft or a plinking 22, this is a great entrance into that without spending a fortune. Now, as far as longevity goes, I can't say that this is going to last you forever. I can't say that this is going to take the recoil of a 308, but Primary Arms has a really good warranty from what I've heard. I have not personally tested it, nor do I have any plans on doing that in the near future. But for the price, it still doesn't ultimately matter all too much. This thing is also very lightweight. All right, well, it's not super lightweight, it's 17 ounces, but it also includes these really nice flip-up caps. They're not Butler Creek, they feel like they're made of a slightly harder plastic that might crack over time, but you know what? It's nice that they're also included. Now, I didn't do a lot of filming with the flip caps on because it does shorten the field of view slightly. I'll probably make a dedicated video to that one day in the future, but it's a really slick package. Now, I had mentioned earlier about the Athlon Talos BTR 1-4 that I reviewed, and you know what? I still have it in my possession. This comes with just bikini covers. It also comes in around $150 to $160, which is $20 to $30 more expensive than that. It comes in a little bit heavier, but if we were to take the scope bikini cover off, it's still a little bit over an ounce heavier. Now, I did mention this scope in the review several times, and that's because this is a good scope that when I reviewed, I liked it, and I still do. But I prefer an LPVO with capped turrets that keep it really simple. There's less for me to have to worry about with this as opposed to this. Plus, the packaging is a lot sleeker and slimmer. Granted, the Athlon is shorter by a fair amount. If we were to button these up to the rear, clearly see about a 2-inch difference. But overall, I'd still take the Primary Arms. Now, I don't have a Crossfire 2 1-4 anymore. That was a long time ago I did that review, and I sold it to a friend of mine. He's happy with it. But from what I can remember with that, very clearly, the glass didn't seem as crisp as this, and the eye relief was, nothing special. This thing's 1X, as you saw, is impressive. For $130, if you're looking to get into airsoft or put this on a plinker, I think you'd be very happy with it. And again, you're not breaking the bank at $130. Kudos, Primary Arms. Kudos. Thank you very much for watching. See you again next time. And a huge thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Without you, this wouldn't be possible.